Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of me pretending I understand human psychology while having the credentials of a grocery store clerk. Today we're dissecting the absolutely fascinating psychological puzzle that is Joe Biden. You know, the guy who's been in politics longer than some countries have existed and somehow still manages to surprise us with his unique approach to human interaction. We're going to explore what makes this man tick, from his notorious habit of sniffing hair to his uncanny ability to turn any simple story into an epic novel about corn pop. Before we start this completely unauthorized psychological evaluation, smash that like button and tell me in the comments what other political figures you think deserve the full amateur therapist treatment. Now, let's dive right into Biden's most obvious psychological trait: his complete inability to understand personal space boundaries. This is a man who approaches strangers like a golden retriever who hasn't seen humans in weeks. You know, that friend who stands way too close when they talk. Biden took that energy and made it a political career. Biden grew up in a middle-class Irish Catholic family, the eldest of 4 children, which already tells us something interesting about his personality formation. Eldest children, according to actual psychology, tend to be natural leaders, responsible, and sometimes a little too eager to please authority figures. Keep that in mind, because it's going to come up a lot. His father sold cars, which, if you think about it, is basically professional charm and persuasion, so maybe Joe inherited some of that natural salesman energy. The family moved to Delaware when he was 10, and here's where things get psychologically interesting. Biden had a severe stutter as a child. Now, before you think I'm going to make fun of a speech impediment, I'm not. That would be terrible. But what's fascinating from a psychological perspective is how childhood stuttering often shapes personality development. Kids who stutter frequently develop what we call compensatory behaviors. They become hyper-aware of social situations, sometimes overly empathetic, and often develop an almost compulsive need to connect with people. Sound familiar? Biden famously overcame his stutter by practicing speaking in front of a mirror and reciting poetry, which honestly sounds like the origin story of someone who would later spend 50 years talking for a living. But here's the thing about overcoming a major childhood challenge: it often creates what psychologists call a prove-yourself mentality. You spend your whole life trying to demonstrate that you're not that struggling kid anymore. And boy, does Biden demonstrate. The man has been in elected office since 1972. That's not a career, that's a geological era. He became a senator at 29, which made him the 6th youngest senator in US history. Now, someone asked me recently if Biden shows signs of what we might call chronic approval-seeking behavior, and honestly, that's a really good question. Look at his career trajectory: Senate Judiciary Committee, Foreign Relations, multiple presidential runs, 8 years as vice president, and then, at 77, he decides to run for president again. Most people at 77 are complaining about their back and arguing with their television. Biden's out there campaigning like he's auditioning for the role of leader of the free world, which technically he was. But there's something almost compulsive about it, like he physically cannot stop seeking positions of authority and responsibility. It's like he's permanently stuck in eldest child mode, constantly raising his hand and saying, "I can handle this, pick me." Now, let's talk about his communication style, because this is where things get really interesting from a psychological standpoint. Biden is what we might call a chronic oversharer. The man cannot tell a simple story. Ask him about the weather, and he'll somehow work in a story about his grandfather, a lesson about resilience, and probably a random fact about Amtrak. Speaking of Amtrak, the man loves trains with the passion of a 5-year-old who just discovered Thomas the Tank Engine. He rode the train from Delaware to Washington for 36 years, earning the nickname Amtrak Joe. Now, this might seem like a cute quirk, but from a psychological perspective, it's actually quite revealing. People who develop intense attachments to routine and specific objects or systems often do so as a way of creating stability and control in their lives. Remember, Biden's early life was marked by a move, a speech impediment, and the general chaos of being the oldest of 4 kids. Trains are predictable, they run on schedule, they go from point A to point B. It's the opposite of the unpredictable world of politics. But here's where Biden gets really psychologically interesting. He's simultaneously someone who craves routine and predictability, and someone who's spent his entire career in one of the most unpredictable, chaotic professions imaginable. It's like being afraid of heights but choosing to become a professional tightrope walker. The contradiction is fascinating. Now, somebody asked me if Biden displays what we might call grandiose storytelling tendencies. And oh boy, do we need to talk about this. The man has a documented history of, let's call them, creative embellishments in his personal narratives. He's claimed to have been arrested trying to see Nelson Mandela, which apparently never happened. He's told stories about confronting a gang leader named Corn Pop at a swimming pool, which sounds like something a screenwriter would reject for being too ridiculous. He's described being shot at in Iraq, which, according to people who were actually there, also didn't happen. Now, before you think I'm just picking on the guy, this is actually a recognized psychological phenomenon. It's called confabulation, and it's different from lying. Lying is intentional deception. Confabulation is when someone genuinely believes their own embellished or false memories. It often happens in people who have experienced trauma, stress, or who have a deep psychological need to see themselves as heroic or significant. Biden's stories always cast him as the brave protagonist, the guy who stood up to the bully, the one who took risks for justice. It's like he's constantly rewriting his own biography to match the person he wishes he had been. From a psychological standpoint, this suggests someone with a somewhat fragile sense of self-worth who needs external validation and heroic narratives to feel secure. Which honestly makes sense for someone who spent his childhood struggling with a stutter and then chose a career where people constantly judge and criticize everything you do. Let's talk about his interpersonal style, because this is where Biden gets really interesting. The man is what we might call a compulsive boundary crosser. He's famous for invading personal space, touching people without permission, and making comments that would get most people a visit from HR. He's sniffed hair, whispered in ears, and made remarks about people's appearance that would make a normal person cringe into another dimension. Now, someone asked me if this represents a lack of social awareness or something more concerning, and honestly, it's probably a bit of both. Biden grew up in an era and culture where physical affection and casual touching were more normalized, especially among politicians. But he's also someone who seems to have an almost desperate need for physical connection and validation. It's like he's constantly trying to create intimacy and warmth, even when it's completely inappropriate. From a psychological perspective, this often stems from childhood experiences of inconsistent affection or emotional availability. People who are touchy as adults sometimes learned early that physical contact was the most reliable way to get attention and affection. But here's the thing that makes Biden's behavior particularly interesting. He seems genuinely confused when people point out that his behavior makes them uncomfortable. It's not malicious. It's more like he's operating from a completely different social rulebook than everyone else. He's like someone who learned social skills from a 1950s etiquette manual and never got the updates. Now, let's talk about his relationship with authority and power, because this reveals a lot about his psychological makeup. Biden has spent his entire adult life in positions of authority, but he's also someone who seems to constantly seek approval from other authority figures. As vice president, he was famously deferential to Obama, almost to the point of being obsequious. He seemed to genuinely worship the guy, which is psychologically interesting for someone who was supposedly the second most powerful person in the country. It suggests someone who's more comfortable being the loyal lieutenant than the ultimate decision-maker. Even as president, Biden often seems to be looking around for approval, like he's not entirely sure he's supposed to be there. It's the psychological profile of someone who's spent so long climbing the ladder that they're not quite sure what to do when they reach the top. This connects back to that eldest child psychology I mentioned earlier. Eldest children are often natural leaders, but they're also people pleasers who desperately want to be seen as responsible and worthy. Biden's entire career has been about proving he's responsible enough, experienced enough, worthy enough. But there's something almost tragic about it, like he's permanently stuck trying to impress parents who are never quite satisfied. Let's talk about his coping mechanisms, because Biden has faced some genuinely traumatic experiences that have shaped his psychological profile. In 1972, just weeks after being elected to the Senate, his wife and daughter were killed in a car accident. His 2 sons were critically injured but survived. This is the kind of trauma that fundamentally changes a person's psychological makeup. Biden's response was to throw himself into work and family with an almost manic intensity. He famously commuted from Delaware to Washington every day to be home with his sons, earning that Amtrak nickname I mentioned earlier. But here's what's psychologically interesting about his response to trauma. Instead of withdrawing or becoming cynical, Biden seemed to double down on his belief in connection, family, and public service. It's like the tragedy reinforced his existing psychological tendencies rather than changing them. He became more touchy, more emotional, more insistent on the importance of human connection. From a psychological perspective, this suggests someone who uses external relationships and activities to manage internal pain. He's what we might call an externalizer, someone who processes emotions through action and connection rather than introspection. Which explains why he's never really retired, never really slowed down, never really stopped seeking new challenges and connections. The alternative, sitting still with his own thoughts and feelings, might be too painful. Now, somebody asked me about Biden's relationship with aging and mortality, and this is where things get really psychologically complex. The man became president at 77, making him the oldest person ever elected to the office. But he seems to have a fascinating relationship with his own aging process. On one hand, he's clearly aware of his age and limitations. He's made verbal gaffes, physical stumbles, and moments of confusion that suggest cognitive decline. But on the other hand, he seems almost defiant about it, like he's determined to prove that age is just a number. It's psychologically fascinating because it suggests someone who's simultaneously accepting and denying reality. He knows he's old, but he's going to act like he's not. And if you point it out, he'll get defensive. It's like watching someone play psychological chess with Father Time. From a clinical perspective, this kind of cognitive dissonance often creates anxiety and compensatory behaviours. Biden's increasingly frequent references to his past, his stories about the good old days, his insistence on his own relevance, these all suggest someone who's struggling with the psychological reality of aging. He's trying to maintain his sense of identity and purpose in the face of physical and cognitive decline, which, honestly, is pretty human and understandable, even if it's not always pretty to watch. Let's talk about his political persona versus his private psychology, because there's a fascinating disconnect here. Publicly, Biden presents himself as middle-class Joe, the regular guy from Scranton who understands working people. But psychologically, he's someone who's been in positions of power and privilege for over 50 years. He's spent more time in government than most people spend in their entire careers. The disconnect between his self-image and his actual life experience is psychologically revealing. It suggests someone who's created a narrative identity that may not match his lived reality. He genuinely seems to believe he's still that working-class kid from Scranton, even though he's been a millionaire senator and vice president for decades. This kind of cognitive dissonance often develops in people who experience rapid social mobility. They maintain their original identity even as their circumstances change dramatically. It's psychologically protective. but it can also create blind spots and disconnection from current reality. Biden's policies and perspective sometimes seem stuck in an earlier era, which makes sense if part of his psyche is still living in 1950s Scranton. Now, let's talk about his relationship with conflict and confrontation, because this reveals a lot about his psychological makeup. Biden has a fascinating pattern of avoiding direct confrontation while simultaneously creating dramatic narratives about his own courage. He'll tell stories about confronting bullies and standing up to bad guys, but his actual political career has been marked by compromise, consensus building, and working across the aisle. It's like he wants to be seen as a fighter, but his actual instinct is to be a peacemaker. From a psychological perspective, this suggests someone who's uncomfortable with his own aggressive impulses. He's created a persona that allows him to feel tough and principled while actually avoiding most real conflicts. It's a pretty sophisticated psychological defense mechanism, actually. He gets to maintain his self-image as a tough guy while rarely having to actually be confrontational. But it also creates problems when real leadership requires making hard choices and accepting that not everyone will like you. Biden sometimes seems genuinely surprised when people disagree with him or criticize his decisions. It's like he's so invested in being the guy everyone likes that he can't quite accept that leadership sometimes requires being unpopular. Somebody asked me about his family dynamics and how they've shaped his psychology, and this is really important to understand. Biden's relationship with his family is almost pathologically close. His son Hunter's struggles with addiction and legal problems would have ended most political careers, but Biden has stood by him with an almost desperate loyalty. His relationship with his late son Beau is so intense that he still references him constantly, years after his death. From a psychological perspective, this suggests someone whose identity is deeply enmeshed with his family relationships. He doesn't just love his family, he needs them to validate his sense of self-worth. This often develops in people who experienced early loss or trauma. The family becomes not just a source of love, but a psychological lifeline. Biden's decision to run for president in 2020 was partly motivated by his belief that Beau would have wanted him to. He's literally making major life decisions based on what he thinks his deceased son would have wanted. That's not normal grief. That's psychological dependency that extends beyond the grave. It's touching in some ways, but it also suggests someone who struggles with independent decision-making and self-validation. Now, let's talk about his relationship with truth and reality, because this is where Biden gets really psychologically complex. I mentioned his confabulation earlier, but it goes deeper than that. Biden seems to have a very flexible relationship with objective reality. He'll make claims that are easily fact-checked and proven false, but he seems genuinely surprised when people point this out. It's like he lives in a world where emotional truth is more important than factual accuracy. If something feels true to him, if it fits his narrative about himself and the world, then it becomes true in his mind. This is actually a recognized psychological phenomenon called motivated reasoning. People unconsciously process information in ways that support their existing beliefs and self-image. But Biden takes it to an almost artistic level. He's created an entire alternative reality where he's the hero of every story, the victim of every unfair attack, and the solution to every problem. From a psychological perspective, this suggests someone with a very fragile relationship with reality. He needs the world to make sense in a very specific way, and when it doesn't, he unconsciously adjusts the facts, rather than adjusting his worldview. It's psychologically protective, but it's also pretty dangerous when you're in a position of real power and responsibility. Let's talk about his emotional regulation, because Biden is someone who wears his emotions very publicly. He cries at public events, he gets angry during debates, he shows affection and frustration in ways that most politicians carefully control. On one hand, this makes him seem more human and relatable than typical politicians. On the other hand, it suggests someone who struggles with emotional boundaries and professional composure. From a psychological perspective, This kind of emotional volatility often develops in people who learned early that dramatic emotional expression was the best way to get attention and care. Biden's childhood stutter might have contributed to this. Kids who struggle with verbal communication sometimes learn to communicate through emotional expression instead. They become more emotionally expressive as a way of making sure their needs are understood and met. But it also suggests someone who uses emotional expression as a form of manipulation, whether conscious or unconscious. Biden's tears and anger often seem strategically timed to deflect criticism or generate sympathy. It's like he's learned that emotional vulnerability is a powerful political tool, which is psychologically sophisticated, but also a little concerning when you think about it. Now, somebody asked me about Biden's legacy consciousness, and this is really important to understand his current psychological state. The man is clearly obsessed with how he'll be remembered by history. He frequently references his place in historical events, his relationships with past presidents, his role in major legislation. He seems to be constantly narrating his own biography for posterity. From a psychological perspective, this suggests someone who's deeply anxious about his own significance and mortality. He needs to believe that his life has mattered, that he's made a difference, that he'll be remembered positively. This often intensifies in older adults who are facing their own mortality. But Biden takes it to an almost compulsive level. He can't just do a job, he has to be historically significant while doing it. He can't just make a decision, he has to explain how it fits into the grand narrative of his legacy. It's psychologically exhausting, both for him and for everyone around him. But it also explains why he ran for president at 77. He needed one more chapter in his historical narrative, one more chance to be the hero of his own story. Let's wrap this up by talking about what all of this tells us about Biden's core psychological profile. He's someone who spent his entire life trying to prove that he's worthy of love, respect, and authority. The stuttering kid from Scranton who became the most powerful person in the world. But he's never quite convinced that he deserves it, so he keeps seeking more validation, more approval, more evidence that he matters. He's psychologically stuck in a loop of seeking external validation while simultaneously creating narratives that justify his own importance. It's created someone who's simultaneously deeply empathetic and completely self-absorbed. He genuinely cares about people, but he also needs them to care about him. He wants to help, but he also wants to be seen as the helper. From a clinical perspective, Biden displays traits consistent with what we might call compensatory narcissism. He's not a classic narcissist who believes he's inherently superior. He's someone who's deeply insecure about his own worth, so he's created an elaborate psychological structure to convince himself and others that he's special. It's actually pretty sad when you think about it. Here's a guy who's achieved more than most people could dream of, but he's never quite able to enjoy it because he's always worried about whether he's good enough. He's like someone who's won the lottery, but is still checking the numbers to make sure they read them correctly. The tragedy is that all of this psychological complexity, all of these defense mechanisms and compensatory behaviors, they've made him successful in many ways. But they've also made him somewhat disconnected from reality and dependent on external validation in ways that aren't always healthy. So there you have it, folks. Joe Biden, the psychologically complex, emotionally volatile, historically obsessed, boundary-crossing, story-embellishing, family-enmeshed, validation-seeking leader of the free world. He's like if someone took all the most interesting psychological defense mechanisms and wrapped them up in a Delaware senator who really, really loves trains. If you enjoyed this completely unauthorized psychological analysis, make sure to subscribe for more amateur diagnoses of people who definitely didn't ask for my opinion. And remember, I'm not a real psychologist, I just play one on the internet, which honestly probably makes me about as qualified as most of the people giving political commentary these days. Until next time, keep analysing, keep questioning, And keep remembering that we're all just trying to figure out this weird thing called human psychology, even when the humans in question happen to be running countries. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next completely unqualified character assassination.